"I'm freezing. Can I get in, please, I beg you?" said the desperate Apache woman to the cowboy. The sun hadn't risen yet. The land outside was frozen solid, locked in the unyielding grip of a mountain winter. No movement, no color, just a vast white canvas broken only by the sharp skeletal lines of the bare trees. The only sound was the wind, a thin whining blade that cut down through the canyon pass, sifting fresh snow against the side of Elias's cabin. The roof groaned under the weight of it, and the logs that formed the walls moaned once before, settling back into a tense silence. A ribbon of cold air sharp as a fresh wound seeped in through the gaps, but the fire inside kept a thin, stubborn line of warmth going. It was enough. Elias was already up. He never slept past first light. His body wouldn't allow it. A habit born in the war, cemented by 5 winters of living alone out here. It was a kind of muscle memory, a twitch in the soul that told him the world outside was waking up and he needed to be ready for it. He sat at the table near the window, his shirt sleeves rolled to his forearms, his right leg stretched out stiff under the bench. He was grinding a wet stone slow and steady across his skinning knife. The blade didn't need it, not really. It was sharp enough to shave a hair off his arm. But keeping his hands busy was the same as keeping his thoughts quiet. He was 40, lean and long-limbed, weathered like a piece of old timber. His right leg dragged a little when he walked. The wound was an old one, a bullet that had torn through a deep muscle at Cold Harbor. The army surgeon back then had said it would stiffen up in winter. He'd been right. 5 years on, and the cold was its own kind of memory. A constant dull throb that reminded him of things he'd rather forget. His land stretched about 30 acres down a frozen ridge. He didn't farm much, just enough to get by in summer. In winter it was trapping and preserved goods, old dried elk and boiled roots when game was scarce. He had no one to feed but himself. That had once felt wrong, a hollow ache in his chest. Now after 5 years it felt normal. It was just a fact of the world, like the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. He didn't keep a clock. He didn't need one. The cold told time better than brass and gears. He moved slow to the stove, a habit born of years of nursing a bad leg and a tired heart. He threw on more kindling, the crackle and hiss of the new wood, a welcome sound in the quiet space. Then he returned to the table and looked at the blade in his hands. It caught the lantern light, a silver sliver in the dim room. His hands were calloused, his knuckles thick from years of work and war. His fingertips twitched once. The knock came just before dawn. It was a soft, uncertain knock, 3 quick taps, then silence. Elias didn't move at first. He didn't expect visitors. No one came this far without purpose, and there wasn't much in his cabin worth stealing. A shotgun, a good horse, and a few years' worth of supplies. He considered ignoring it, but that wasn't his way. A man of honor, however jaded, didn't turn away a soul, and need not in this kind of weather. Still, he stood pulling on his thick wool coat. His boots felt heavy on the floor. His hand hovered near the shotgun propped beside the stove, but he didn't pick it up. Not yet. He unlatched the top hook and swung the door open a few inches. The cold hit him first, a vicious slap of air that stole his breath. Then he saw her. A woman. Apache by the look of her. Young, maybe in her mid-20s. She stood barefoot in the snow, her breath coming fast and white in the air. Her skin was bronze but gone pale at the lips. Her long black hair was tangled and wet strands clinging to her face. She was trembling hard. Her deerskin dress was torn at the neckline and across the hip, exposing the top curve of her chest, her bare thigh, and skin bruised purple by the cold. One moccasin was missing. The other was soaked through. The beads on her dress clinked faintly in the wind, a lonely, fragile sound. Her eyes flicked up, meeting his. She didn't look crazed. She didn't look broken. She looked scared and past scared, exhausted. Every part of her was shaking, but her jaw stayed tight, a final show of defiant strength. "Please," she said, her voice cracked and uneven, a whisper against the wind. "Can I get in? I'm freezing. I beg you." She looked ready to collapse, but didn't. Her legs held. She didn't move toward him. She waited. Elias's fingers tensed slightly around the door edge. His first instinct was hesitation. Apache or not, she was a stranger. He lived alone for a reason. He didn't open his door to anyone. Not since the fever took his wife and little girl 5 years ago. He'd buried them himself, his hands raw and bleeding from the frozen earth. After that, silence was safer. Silence didn't leave. It didn't make promises it couldn't keep. But this wasn't someone coming to sell something or beg for food. She wasn't armed, and she was barefoot in a storm, half dead from the cold. Her words weren't rehearsed. She didn't even ask for food, just warmth. Her desperation was raw and real, a plea that clawed at the walls he had so carefully built around his heart. He stepped back without a word, pulling the door fully open. The warmth of the fire spilled out a golden invitation. She didn't speak again. She just walked in slow and unsteady, her entire being focused on the heat. Elias shut the door behind her and barred it, locking out the cold. Inside, her eyes darted once around the room. The rough timber walls, the low cot in the corner, the rack of traps near the back, the pile of chopped wood stacked next to the stove. She didn't comment, just moved closer to the fire and sank to her knees. Her hands hovered over the flames, palms spread, trembling uncontrollably. Elias watched her for a few seconds. Her shoulders were raw. The skin around her collarbone was reddened from windburn. He saw bruises, small lash marks visible between the strands of her hair. She was shaking hard enough to rattle the beads on her dress. A wave of gut-wrenching pity, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years, washed over him. He crossed to the cot, pulled off the wool blanket, walked back, and draped it over her shoulders without touching her skin. She flinched slightly but didn't pull away. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. She just stared at the fire, her eyes wide, glassy with fatigue and cold, her mind still somewhere else in the storm. He poured warm water from the kettle into a tin mug and set it on the floor near her knees. She didn't drink it right away. She was still letting the heat return to her body, a slow, painstaking process. Elias stepped back, sat down again at the table. He didn't speak. He didn't ask where she came from or what happened to her. The bruises and torn clothes told enough of a story. There'd be time later or there wouldn't. For now she was alive. He picked up the wet stone again and resumed sharpening his blade. The sound of metal over stone was the only noise in the room besides the crackling of the fire. The woman didn't look at him again for a long while. When she finally did, her eyes held a weariness that went bone deep, but also something else, confusion, curiosity, as if she didn't understand why he hadn't asked her name or demanded anything from her, or thrown her back into the cold. Elias didn't meet her gaze for long. He wasn't used to being looked at anymore, not with that kind of intense, searching gaze. He just kept sharpening. The fire had dropped to a low burn. Elias moved to the stove again and added a split log without speaking. It cracked as it caught flame. The sound filled the space between them, but not enough to chase off the silence that still hung in the room. The woman hadn't moved far from where she'd first collapsed. The blanket was wrapped tight around her shoulders, now her legs tucked beneath her. The steam from the tin mug he'd set down earlier had faded, but the water was still warm enough when she finally reached for it with both hands. She sipped slowly, carefully, as if the water itself was a precious gift. Her fingers shook against the metal. Her lips were dry and cracked. She didn't make a sound. Elias stayed across the room, sitting on the edge of the chair, both elbows resting on his thighs. He watched the fire more than he watched her, but his eyes flicked to her movements now and then, measured, guarded. She hadn't spoken since the first words at the door. He wasn't expecting more just yet. He understood that kind of quiet. 5 years ago, after the fever took his wife and daughter, within days of each other, he'd stopped talking for nearly 3 weeks. He just fed the fire, sat, and went through the motions of survival. After the burial, he'd come out here to this place and didn't go back. Not to town, not to people. Folks called him strange. Maybe he was. He didn't know her name. Didn't know how far she'd come or how long she'd been in the snow. But it was plain. She hadn't eaten in days. Her arms were strong, but thin skin stretched taut over muscle. The bones in her wrists showed plainly when she held the cup. Her face was round, but the cheeks had hollowed from hunger. He stood without a word and crossed to a wooden crate in the corner. He pulled out what he had: hard biscuits, a tin of salted venison, a small sack of dried beans. Not much, but enough. He set the tin on the stove to warm. She turned her head, tracking him now, still not speaking but aware. "You speak English?" he asked finally, his voice low and unused. She gave a small nod. Enough. He waited, but she didn't offer more. He leaned against the wall near the stove, his eyes on the fire. "You from one of the southern tribes, Kirikawa," she said after a moment, her voice soft and halting, but her words were clear. "But not with them now. Not for a long time." He nodded, once kept his eyes on the fire. "Name?" he asked. She hesitated. Then Leah. He didn't repeat it, didn't distort it. When the tin was warm, he opened it carefully and brought it to her. She hesitated, then reached out and took it. She didn't eat like someone wild, but like someone who'd learned to be careful with food. Slow, efficient, not rushed, no sound, no shame. He sat back down, watching her for only a moment before looking away. She was barefoot under the blanket. Her left foot was red, swollen at the arch, the heel cracked from exposure. She needed warmth and time, not questions. He'd seen prisoners crawl out of less with enough time. Were you running from someone, he asked, keeping his tone neutral. She didn't look at him. Was with traders. So they take me north, then sold me. He waited. She glanced up, met his eyes briefly. I ran. They came after. I don't know where I am now. He gave a short nod. You're in the Bitter Range. Closest town's 30 miles west. No one's coming out here unless they know where to look. That seemed to ease her a little. Her shoulders dropped slightly under the blanket. She finished eating and placed the empty tin aside with care. You heard anywhere else, he asked, more out of duty than conversation. Number, just cold. He took that as truth. He didn't press further. He turned away and gathered a few folded garments from a shelf above his cot, an old flannel shirt, a pair of wool socks, a worn pair of long johns, clean but rough and big on her. He walked over and set them down near the edge of the blanket she clutched. They'll fit enough for now. I'll turn my back. She blinked once, unsure. He didn't wait for her answer. He just walked to the door and stood facing it, arms crossed, silent. Behind him, he heard the shuffle of fabric, the soft intake of breath as she moved slowly and likely in pain. The torn dress made a soft sound as it was unwrapped. He didn't look, wouldn't. After a minute passed, her voice came quietly. Done. He turned back. She sat in the oversized clothes, the sleeves hanging off her wrists, the socks thick around her ankles. The shirt swallowed her shoulders, but it was dry and clean, and she'd pulled her long black hair out from beneath the collar. She looked less like prey now. Not safe yet, but warmer, grounded. You'll stay tonight, he said. She nodded. He walked over to the cot, took a bedroll from underneath and unrolled it beside the hearth. You can take the cot. I'll stay here. Fire holds. She didn't argue, just watched him again. Her eyes lingered this time, not suspicious, not afraid, but curious maybe, or confused, like she still didn't understand what this was. He lay down on the bedroll, pulled the extra blanket over his chest, and stared at the ceiling logs above. She shifted onto the cot a moment later. The frame creaked once. Neither of them spoke again. But just before sleep claimed him, Elias heard her breathing slow, steady close. And for the first time in 5 winters, it wasn't only his own. The light that crept through the frost-laced window wasn't much, but it was enough to push the cabin from night into a colorless kind of morning. The fire had burned low, mostly ash now. Cold had returned to the edges of the room, creeping in through the seams between the logs. Elias opened his eyes and exhaled hard through his nose. The breath turned visible in front of him. He sat up slowly on the bedroll, one hand pressing against the floor to steady his weight. The limp in his right leg was worse in the mornings, especially after a cold night on the floor. Still, he didn't groan, just grit his teeth as he stood and flexed the joint until it accepted his weight. He'd learned to manage pain like he managed weather. Acknowledge it, endure it, move through it. He glanced toward the cot. Leah was curled on her side blanket around her shoulders, her face relaxed in sleep. She hadn't moved much. Her long hair was fanned across the pillow, the dark strands catching the pale gray light. The flannel shirt she wore had twisted a bit in the night, slipping off one shoulder. Her legs were bent, hands tucked close to her chest. She didn't shiver. Elias turned away and got the fire going again. It was quiet work, just kindling breath and a careful hand with the coals. The crackling returned slow and steady, warming the space again. He didn't wake her. Instead, he stepped outside. The cold was hard and fast. He pulled his coat tighter and looked out over the land. Snow had drifted again during the night, thinner than before, but still enough to smooth the world into a flat sheet of white. The mountains in the distance were fogged at their peaks. The trap lines would need checking, and there was more wood to split. He thought about riding to town just to restock what he'd given her. Maybe ask if anyone had come through asking about a runaway Apache woman, but he stopped that thought fast. He didn't know the answers, and he didn't trust the town with hers. When he stepped back inside, Leah was sitting upright. She wasn't startled, just watching the door quietly as it shut behind him. Her eyes were clear now. She looked like she'd slept and badly needed it. He nodded at her, then walked past to the stove. I'll cook something, he said. She didn't speak, but the way she shifted, pulling the blanket tighter around herself, her feet drawn back under the cot, said she understood. He cooked in silence. Salt pork, a boiled potato cut rough, and a bit of the last of the cornmeal mash. He set 2 plates down on the table, one near her, and sat across from it. Leah approached slowly, still limping slightly on her raw foot. She sat without comment, then began eating. Small bites. She didn't waste anything. After a few minutes, he broke the silence. Where'd they pick you up, the traders? Leah chewed and swallowed, her eyes on her plate. South of Tombstone, near the river crossing. I was traveling east. They caught me. Said they give food. I was hungry. Elias's jaw tensed, but he didn't show much else. He knew the kind of men who made those promises. You were with your people before that. She shook her head. No tribe. Not anymore. She didn't explain. He didn't push. But he understood what that meant. Either exiled or fled. Both carried the same silence behind them. You got anyone looking for you, he asked. Number that too, was said plain. Not sad, just fact. He gave a short nod and took another bite. The fire cracked behind them. The wind had gone quiet. After they ate, he stood and pulled his coat on again. Got traps to check. You stay inside. Don't open for anyone. Nobody should come. But if they do, you wait for me. She nodded once, but then stood. I can help. He looked her over. Foot's no good. You'll stay. Leah looked down for a second. Her lip twitched like she might argue, but she didn't. She sat back down. Before he left, Elias pulled a loaded rifle from the wall and set it beside the door. You know how to use one? She looked at it, then met his eyes. Yes, he nodded. Only if you need to. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the pale morning. The walk down to the nearest trap line was quiet. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and the wind had dropped low enough that it felt like the world was holding its breath. His traps had yielded 2 hares, both frozen stiff. He reset the line, bagged the meat, and turned back toward the cabin. He wasn't gone long, less than an hour. But the entire way back, his thoughts circled the same place. He didn't know what to do with her. Not really. He hadn't spoken to anyone outside of traders and storekeepers in years. He didn't have much, but what he had was steady. Now this woman Leah was in it. Just showed up in the cold and knocked on his door like some test he hadn't asked for. But he hadn't turned her away, and he couldn't stop thinking about the way she didn't beg once she was inside. She hadn't cried, hadn't asked for anything more than what she needed to survive. She didn't cling, but she hadn't tried to leave either. She just stayed quiet and warm and alive. When he got back to the cabin, the smoke from the chimney was steady. Inside, the place was clean. His tools had been stacked properly on the workbench. The tin mugs had been washed and dried. She hadn't touched the rifle. She was standing by the fire, her back to him, hair freshly combed and rebraided. She turned when he came in and stepped back, slightly unsure of how to read him. But Elias just set the bag of hairs down and said, "We'll skin these together. After, I'll boil water for your foot." Leah nodded. "Thank you." It was the first time she'd said that. He only answered with a quiet grunt, but something inside him shifted, small, weighty. It wasn't pity. It was just a shared task. The hairs were laid out across a cracked wooden board, their stiff legs curled inward, their eyes frozen open. He had already removed the traps and hung them to dry on the outer porch. Inside, the warmth held steady now, the fire banked high. Leah knelt beside him on the floor, sleeves rolled, her hands raw but steady. He watched the way she worked. Careful. Exact. She didn't flinch at blood. She didn't shy from the blade. She skinned with knowledge. "You've done this before," he said quietly. Leah nodded once. "My grandfather taught me. When I was young." He didn't press her about the rest. What happened to him? How long ago young had been? If she wanted to say, she would. What mattered was the way her hands moved now. She didn't ask what to do. She knew. He passed her the second carcass and sat back on his heels. His leg ached, but he ignored it. Instead, he studied her face in the firelight. There was more color there now. The hollows beneath her eyes had softened. The flannel shirt she wore hung loose at her shoulders, but she had retied it at the waist with a strip of torn cloth. Practical. Modest. She hadn't asked for a new dress yet. He suspected she wouldn't. "You going to keep moving when your foot heals?" he asked, suddenly not sure why he said it out loud. Leah didn't stop working. "I don't know." He nodded, slowly rubbed his thumb against a ridge scar along his jaw. "No one's looking for you." "You said that." "No one," she repeated. Silence again. He turned toward the stove and dropped another log in. The snap of bark echoed in the quiet. "Why'd you come this far north?" he asked. Leah wiped her hands on the cloth and sat back against the base of the cot. She looked toward the window where frost still formed thick patterns over the glass. For a long time she didn't answer. When she did, her voice was steady but low. "After they sold me, I escaped. I walked nights, hid in the hills. I followed the stars for a time, but I didn't know where I was going. Just away." He understood that part. The walking, the aimlessness, the need to move not toward something but away from something else. "I found a burned cabin," she continued. "No roof, no food. I stayed one night. Snow came. I tried to follow tracks downhill. I saw smoke. That was your place." He frowned slightly. "That burned cabin's about 5 miles east." She nodded. "You crossed the gulch with one shoe in a storm. I had no choice." He let out a slow breath and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Why didn't you just knock and say more?" he asked. Leah's voice barely rose. "You're a white man alone with a gun." He didn't argue. Instead, he walked to a shelf near the back and opened a small chest. Inside were folded bandages, a tin of salve, and strips of boiled linen. He brought them back, sat across from her. "Take off the sock," he said. She hesitated, then obeyed. The foot was still red and angry, cracked around the heel, raw around the ankle, but it wasn't frostbitten, not deep. It would heal. He dipped a cloth in warm water, cleaned the skin gently. Leah didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed fixed on the flames behind him, but her mouth was tight. "This will sting. I can handle it." She did. He wrapped it clean, tied it off, and sat back. "You'll need better clothes. Boots," he said. She looked down at her borrowed shirt and nodded once. "I'll mend the dress. Just need a needle. I have one, but the seams." He hesitated, choosing his words. "They're too torn. You need better." She looked at him then, for the first time, directly. "You want me to look better?" It wasn't coy. It wasn't baiting. It was cautious, careful, testing his intent. He didn't blink. "No. I want you warm. Covered. Safe." Leah held his gaze a moment longer, then looked down again. "All right." Later that day, he carved meat from the hares and salted it for drying. Leah swept the floor and reorganized the supplies. She did it without asking, without assuming. She moved like someone used to labor, someone who expected no thanks. That evening, after a meal of stew and hardtack, Elias sat by the fire sharpening the axe blade. Leah brought a stack of wood in from the porch and placed it down by the stove. She hesitated, then stood there a while watching him. "Do you live here year-round?" she asked. "I do." "Why alone?" He looked up slowly, then back to the blade. "Lost my family. Long time back." Leah didn't sit. She didn't cry. She just stood in the same place and said, "I'm sorry." He didn't reply. Not with words. But when he stood, stretched his back, and limped over to the stove, he poured the last of the coffee into a tin mug and handed it to her without comment. She took it quiet, sat down on the edge of the cot, and sipped. That night, he laid out his bedroll near the fire again. When he looked up, she was still sitting on the cot watching him. The light from the fire glowed across her bare feet and up the hem of the flannel shirt, which had slipped again slightly off one shoulder. Her legs were tucked beneath her, her face unreadable. Then she laid down, turned away, and said nothing. Neither did he, but something between them now held a new shape. Not comfort, not love, just permission. They were both still here, and neither one had run. The snow didn't fall that night, but the cold deepened. When Elias stirred just before dawn, the fire had dropped to low embers, and the air inside the cabin bit like steel. He pulled the blanket tighter over his chest, his eyes adjusting slowly to the dim orange flicker of dying coals. The floor beneath his shoulder was hard, unforgiving, and his right leg ached like it had been nailed straight through. He lay still for a moment, listening. There was breathing, light, steady, not his own. He turned his head. Leah was on the cot, still facing the wall, her dark hair spilling over the edge. The wool blanket was drawn to her chin, one bare arm tucked under it. She hadn't cried out in the night, hadn't moved much either. He rose stiffly, bones cracking, and added 2 fresh logs to the fire. As the flames jumped and stretched again, heat licked back into the room. The shadows pushed away from the walls. He poured water into the kettle and stood waiting as it warmed, then reached for the old tin basin on the shelf. Behind him, the cot shifted. Wood creaked. He didn't turn but spoke low. "Water's warming. I'll leave the basin out for your foot." Leah's voice came soft. "All right." He glanced over his shoulder. She sat up slowly, the blanket falling into her lap. Her long legs were still bare beneath the oversized flannel, but the swelling in her foot looked better this morning, less angry. Her face looked clearer, too, rested, more present. "You sleep all right?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm not used to quiet." He understood that. She didn't need to explain. Noise could be its own kind of danger. He brought the basin and set it down with the hot water beside it. She dipped her foot in, slowly, wincing, but only for a second. He turned away and busied himself with coffee. Later, when the sun finally broke across the ridge, the cabin lit up in shades of gray, blue, and gold. The world outside looked calm, deceptively so. The snow was crusted in hard layers where it had melted and refroze. Elias stood on the porch and looked across his land. Nothing stirred, no tracks, no signs of trouble. Inside, Leah was folding the blankets with tight, practiced motions. He hadn't asked her to, and she hadn't waited for permission. She just did it. When he came back in, she looked up. "I can chop today," she said. "Wood or clean." He shook his head. "You're still healing." She stood straighter. "My foot is better." He looked at her for a long second, gauging the way she held her weight. The limp was there, but less sharp than before. He set the kettle back on the stove and stepped to the corner where the axe leaned. "All right," he said. "We'll do it together. I'll show you the grain of the wood." They went outside, both bundled in layers. He gave her his second coat, far too large for her shoulders, and she wrapped it tight. Her dress had been washed, patched roughly at the seams, and was drying near the stove, but she didn't ask for it back. Not yet. In the clearing, he showed her where to stand, how to place the logs against the chopping block. His instruction was short demonstration over words. She watched carefully, then tried. Her first swing was poor, angled off center, but she didn't look at him when it stuck. She just pried the blade out and tried again. By the third swing, it split clean. He gave a small grunt of approval. They worked like that through the morning. Slow but steady. She cut. He stacked. When her arm tired, she switched sides without complaint. They didn't talk much. There was no need. By noon, the pile was double what it had been. Back inside, the smell of thawed broth filled the air. Elias stirred the pot while Leah cleaned the axe blade and set it by the door. She moved slower now, fatigue settling in, but didn't sit. They ate at the table again. The routine had taken hold without effort. 2 plates. 2 mugs, fire between them. Halfway through the meal, Elias asked, "When was the last time someone helped you?" Leah looked up slowly, her eyes unreadable. "Before my mother died. I was 17. And how old are you now?" 24. 7 years. He nodded once and took another bite. "You're not asking for anything now either." Leah lowered her eyes. "I don't want pity." "I didn't offer pity." She glanced at him. "Then what?" He leaned back in the chair. "Warmth. A bed. Work if you want it. Food while I have it." And then, he didn't answer right away. He looked at the fire for a long beat. "Then I guess we figure it out." Leah set her spoon down, her hands folded in her lap, fingers tangled. "I don't know how to live slow," she said quietly. "You'll learn," he said. "Or you won't. But you're safe here, if that counts for anything." She nodded once. "It does." That night she sat by the fire longer than usual, her shoulders relaxed, her foot soaking in silence. Elias read an old trail journal by lamplight. Half the pages were smudged, the spine split from years of weather. Eventually she rose and walked to the cot, dragging her blanket behind her. She turned before climbing in. "Why'd you open the door?" she asked. He looked at her, one brow drawn slightly. "What do you mean I was dirty? Barely dressed. Could have been a trick. Could have been dangerous." "You knocked," he said plainly. "That was enough." He paused. "You didn't lie. You didn't beg after. You just asked, and you were freezing." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "All right." She climbed into bed and pulled the blanket high over her chest. He put out the lamp, and again, without plan or force, they fell asleep, breathing the same air, held in the same quiet. The wind picked up again by morning. It howled low along the roofline, rattling the shutters like bones tapping glass. Inside, the fire held strong, but the chill had pushed back into the corners of the cabin. Elias stirred beneath his blanket, his eyes blinking slowly open. The scent of the room had changed. Less smoke, more warmth, something faintly sweet. Leah was already up. She sat cross-legged near the fire, feeding it with small logs from the stack they'd split. She wore the oversized flannel shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, the collar stretched just enough to show the soft line of her neck and shoulder. Her long black hair hung loose today, combed through thick and straight down her back in the quiet morning light. She looked more herself. Or maybe just more here. Elias sat up slowly, rubbing the ache in his thigh. The cold always sank deep into the old wound after sleep. She turned slightly, not startled, just aware. "I boiled water," she said. "You can wash if you want." He nodded once, stood, and moved stiffly toward the back where a wash basin sat. The water was still warm. He used it sparingly, splashing his face and running wet fingers through his hair. When he turned back, she was folding one of the blankets, again hers, from the cot. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." They moved through the morning side by side, tending to quiet tasks. Elias inspected the traps again after a short walk, returning with nothing but one broken spring and a damp coat. Leah peeled dried strips of meat and swept the floor. They ate together without a word. The fire never died. Later, she pulled the patched deerskin dress from the hook where it had hung for days. She didn't say anything, just sat near the fire and began working at the seams with a needle he'd given her days before. Her hands were slow but sure. He watched for a moment, then turned back to the chair and poured black coffee into 2 tin mugs. He brought her one and handed it over without speaking. She accepted it, nodding gently. The sound of the wind faded outside by late afternoon. The sun finally broke clean through the haze, casting long yellow stripes across the floorboards. For once, the cabin felt less like a place of shelter and more like a place that held warmth, movement, breath. She spoke quietly. "You said you lost your family, your wife, your child." He didn't answer right away. The fire cracked in the stove. "Fever," he said finally. "Bad winter. I couldn't get help in time." "How old was the child?" 3. She nodded slowly, staring into her lap. "I lost my brother," she said after a pause. "White ranchers took him. Said he stole a horse. He didn't. They hung him anyway." He looked at her, but she didn't lift her eyes. The tension in her jaw said it all. "That was 5 winters ago," she continued. "After that I left. Tribe didn't say anything. Maybe they were relieved." He didn't respond with pity, just listened. They sat in silence for a while, the room holding the weight of things spoken and unspoken. That night she stood near the fire longer than usual. The shirt she wore was beginning to slip again, unintentional, just the fabric moving with her as she leaned forward to stir the pot of stew. The curve of her hip was visible through the side slit in her patched dress, now tied at her waist. When she turned, her eyes met his unblinking. Not demanding, not uncertain, just seeing. He didn't move toward her. He didn't look away either. She stepped closer. He stayed seated. Her voice was low. "You haven't touched me. Not once. Not even when I was too cold to speak. You needed safety," he said simply. She nodded. "And if I want more than safety now?" He stood slowly. His frame moved with quiet tension, not fear, but something like restraint, braced by years of silence. She was close now. He could see the faint shadow of healing bruises along her shoulder, the soft rise of her chest beneath the worn fabric. She reached up and brushed a hand along his jaw. Her fingers were warm, steady. Still, he didn't rush. His voice came low. "You sure?" She nodded. "I stayed, didn't I?" He looked at her for a long second, then leaned down. When their lips met, it wasn't urgent. It was warm, solid, real. Her hands rested on his chest. His hands held her waist gently, like something breakable he was finally allowed to hold. They didn't speak again that night. But when the lamp burned low and they lay under the same blanket for the first time, her head resting on his chest, and his arm wrapped around her back, neither of them needed to. She wasn't cold anymore, and he wasn't alone. By morning, the cabin was quiet again, but different than before. The silence no longer felt cold or empty. It felt held, shared. The fire crackled steadily. One blanket was folded neatly at the foot of the cot. The other was wrapped around 2 bodies, still close, unmoving, except for the slow, steady rhythm of breath. Elias opened his eyes first. Leah was asleep, her face half hidden against his chest, one hand resting just below his collarbone. Her hair lay across them both like a soft curtain. The edge of the flannel shirt she'd slipped back into the night before was still unbuttoned near the top. Her bare thigh rested along his leg, warm, curved, familiar now. But nothing about it felt rushed or stolen. It felt chosen. She had stayed. He didn't move right away. He didn't want to break the moment. There had been no promises spoken, no declarations, no plans laid out in the dark. But something had changed between them, settled in. Not just a need for shelter or heat or survival. A reason to stay. Eventually she stirred. Her fingers flexed slightly against his chest and her eyes opened slowly. She looked up at him, then down at where she lay. Her expression didn't shift into embarrassment or regret, only quiet understanding. He brushed a thumb along her temple, slow and careful. "You warm enough?" he asked. She gave a soft nod. They dressed slowly after that, each moving through the room without needing to speak much. Elias boiled coffee while Leah combed her hair, then tied it back with a strip of leather from his gear shelf. Her flannel shirt was starting to tear again at the cuff. The patched dress hung where she'd left it last night, still rough, still short, still a reminder of everything she'd come through. But it was hers. She didn't put it on. After breakfast, they stepped outside together. The snow had started to melt in patches beneath the weak sun, but the air was still sharp. Elias pointed out a section of fencing along the eastern edge that had collapsed under the weight of drifting snow. He spoke without assuming, but she followed without being asked. They walked the line with a hammer nails and 2 replacement posts strapped to a sled. When they reached the break, she worked beside him, holding the wood steady while he pounded in the iron. Her hands didn't tremble anymore. The coat he'd given her no longer looked oversized. Her strength filled it out. "You ever fixed fence before?" he asked between strikes. She looked at him flatly. "I fixed worse." He smiled a little, then not wide but real. By midday they'd fixed 3 breaks and cleared snow from the east-facing shed wall. She hadn't slowed once. He kept watching her quietly, trying to gauge what this meant. If she was staying for good, if she would ask for more, or if she would vanish when spring softened the mountain pass. Inside she cooked. The stew was richer this time, with dried potatoes and the last of the wild onion. When they sat, she served him first. He didn't comment on it, but it stayed in his mind. This was the way she'd settled in, not asking permission but acting like she belonged. After the meal, she stood near the fire, brushing down her sleeves. Then she turned to him. "I want to go to town soon," she said. He raised his head. "Why?" "I need boots and cloth and thread. Maybe food. I want to trade something." He set down his cup. "We'll go together, but folks might stare." "I know. Let them," she said. He studied her then. "You sure about that?" Leah stepped closer. Her voice dropped lower. "I'm not ashamed of what I survived, or where I slept last night." He looked up at her and gave a single nod. "All right." She sat beside him close. Their arms touched. After a long moment he said, "If we go to town, they'll ask what you are to me." She looked at him with eyes that didn't flinch or turn away. "What will you say?" He didn't answer right away. Then after a breath he said, "That you're with me. Just with me. I can say wife," he added, his voice low. "If you want that." She was quiet, but not in a way that felt distant. Just careful. Her hand slid to his, resting over it. "Not yet," she said. "But don't say I'm nothing." "I wouldn't," he replied. That night they shared the cot again. There was no urgency, just a long, slow process of bodies finding comfort in proximity. She curled against him like it was natural, like she'd always meant to sleep like that, wrapped up bone against bone. Her fingers along his ribs, his hand at her hip. Before the lamp burned out, she spoke again. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked down at her. "You sure?" "I was never sure before. I am now." Outside, the cold kept the mountains quiet. But inside, two people who had once lived with nothing left to lose now had something neither one expected. A reason to stay. The morning before their trip to town, they prepared in silence. But it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of two people who understood what needed to be done without over-explaining. The snow had crusted hard during the night, but the path down the ridge would hold if they took it slow with the sled. Elias packed the essentials: 2 hares cured for trade, a bundle of pelts, and what remained of his last good coffee. He moved methodically, checking straps and ties, while Leah sorted through her patched dress. She had washed and stitched it again, the beads and fringe cleaned of dirt, but it still bore the scars of her escape. Tears across the side, the neckline split low. She held it in her hands, frowning slightly. Elias noticed. "You don't have to wear that," he said, pulling on his winter coat. "You could take the shirt. I've got another." She glanced up. "This is all I have." "That's yours," he said. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Then keep it. I'll bring my coat for you." When she changed, the dress clung awkwardly to her curves. The leather stretched from damage. It exposed the strong lines of her shoulders, the shape of her hips and chest, but there was no vanity in it, just survival stitched together. She pulled the coat over it and fastened it to her throat. "People in town?" she asked, fastening the last button. "What do they know about you?" "Not much," he replied, checking the rifle sling. "I keep it that way." She tilted her head. "And if they ask who I am, I'll tell them you're with me," he said plainly. "No one will push after that." She seemed to accept it. They left after midday, the sled gliding across the hard snow. The horse, a big bay mare with a scarred flank, pulled the weight without complaint. Leah rode beside Elias. Her dark hair was pulled back beneath his spare hat. Her eyes scanned the horizon as they moved, but not out of fear. More like someone memorizing every line of the land she had nearly died on. The road to town was long and unkind, but they reached the first set of fences before dusk. The settlement of Brunette's Crossing wasn't much more than a dusty strip of wooden fronts and smoke-choked chimneys, but to Leah, it must have felt like walking into another world. She kept her coat closed tight, but her posture remained upright, strong. Inside the general store, heads turned. 2 men near the counter paused mid-conversation, their eyes sweeping over her, not with curiosity alone, but the ugly kind. Judgment mixed with hunger. Elias felt it, saw it. He shifted slightly, moving between her and their stares. "We're here for boots, thread, and grain," he said to the storekeeper, his voice calm but firm. The storekeeper, an older man with a thin face and white whiskers, looked from Elias to Leah and back again. "Ain't seen you bring company before," he said. "She's with me," Elias answered. The man blinked once and didn't ask further. Leah stood close to him, quiet but steady, as they gathered what they needed. The men by the counter whispered once, then snickered, but Elias ignored them. When one of them muttered something under his breath about wild girls and mountain men, Elias turned his head just enough that the look in his eyes froze the man mid-smirk. Nothing more was said. Outside, the sun was sinking. Elias helped Leah onto the sled, placing the boots and fabric beside her. She touched his hand as he adjusted the reins, just briefly but with intention. On the way back, the wind picked up again, sweeping loose snow into their faces. Leah leaned closer into Elias's side for warmth. He didn't speak, but his hand rested lightly on her knee under the coat, steadying her as the sled jolted over the rough path. Back at the cabin, night had fully fallen. They unloaded in silence, their breaths white clouds in the moonlight. Inside, as the fire roared to life again, Leah tried on the boots. Stiff but a perfect fit. She smiled faintly, a rare softness in her expression. "You stood for me today," she said quietly. Elias looked up from the fire. Didn't have to think about it. She stepped closer, still wearing the boots, the flannel coat half open now. The flicker of firelight painted her face, her chest, the curve of her waist. "You said I'm with you. Do you mean that?" He stood slowly, his gaze steady. "I mean it." She searched his face for a moment, then reached up and pulled his collar slightly, her lips brushing his with a soft, deliberate kiss. This time there was no hesitation. Her arms wrapped around his shoulders, his hands at her back, pulling her closer. The warmth between them was undeniable. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. That night, as the storm outside began again, they shared the cot fully. His body curved against hers, her breath warm on his neck. Neither of them spoke much after, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was the kind of silence that felt like home. Before sleep took her, Leah whispered something almost too quiet to catch. "You didn't just save me from the cold. You saved me from being nothing." Elias's hand tightened gently at her waist. He didn't reply with words. He just stayed awake a little longer, watching the fire, knowing that whatever had begun between them was no longer temporary. The wind had quieted by morning. No fresh snow fell overnight, and the sky outside the cabin stretched clear and pale blue. The cold still clung to the windows, but the air inside felt softer, warmer, not just from the fire, but from the way they now moved through the space. It was no longer a shelter for one. It was theirs. Leah stood barefoot on the wooden floor, adjusting the hem of her new dress, the one they'd traded for in town. A deep brown wool, plain but clean with hand-stitched seams, and a high neckline. She'd lowered herself by undoing the top buttons. It clung gently to her curves, not for display, but because it fit her now. It fit her life here. A woman no longer running. She smoothed it over her hips and turned slightly. "It's not Apache, but it's mine." Elias leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. He was watching her. "You look like you belong." She met his gaze, calm and steady. "I do." Outside, the land was thawing. Slow but steady. Drifts had shrunk to patches. The ridge trail had opened. Elias had already pulled the horse from the lean to brush her coat and check the saddles. He wasn't leaving, just preparing for spring. Life didn't stop moving just because it got quieter. Back inside, Leah ladled out the morning stew. She handed him a bowl and sat across from him, pulling one leg under herself. "I've been thinking," she said between bites. "I want to start a garden. You've got land enough." He looked at her, then down at the space near the cabin wall where snow had melted first. "We'll need to break the ground deep. Put up a fence." "I can do that," she said. "You showed me how." He nodded. "We'll need seed too. I can ride west in 2 weeks. Trade the last of the pelts. I'll come with you." He paused. "You sure town's not easy?" "Not for you." She didn't blink. "I won't hide again." It was said with no pride, just fact. After breakfast, they worked in the sun. Elias repaired the gate hinge while Leah began marking lines in the softening soil. Her boots sank in the mud, but she didn't care. The sleeves of her dress were rolled up past the elbow, exposing sun-browned skin and scarred wrists that no longer looked like marks of pain, just survival. By midday, they had cleared a 10-foot stretch of earth and stacked a pile of old fence posts nearby. Elias drove one deep with the back of an axe. Leah leaned on the next one, catching her breath. "You thinking about planting corn?" he asked. "Beans, maybe squash. My mother said, if they grow together, they protect each other." He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the dirt. "That's true." She turned to him. "You thinking about marriage?" He looked up surprised, but only a little. Then he stepped closer. "I've been thinking about it since you first slept in my bed," he said. Her brow lifted faintly. "You waited a long time to say it." "I want it to be real," he said. "Not about what we came through, about what we stay for." Leah looked at the snow behind him, then at the fence they'd built, then finally back at his face. "It's real." He reached in his coat pocket, pulled something out. A ring. Plain iron, shaped unevenly by hand. He made it last week. Wasn't sure if I should ask. You just did, she said. He held it up. Then I'll say it plain. Stay as my wife. Stay here. Not as someone I saved, but as someone I need. She stepped forward and took the ring. Her fingers trembled slightly, only briefly. She slid it on herself. It fit. I'm not leaving, she said. Later that evening, she combed her hair near the fire while he closed the shutters. Their dinner was quiet, comfortable. She kissed him once behind the ear, as he passed her hand resting at his lower back. And when they climbed into bed that night, their limbs wrapped together easily, his arm around her waist, her breath warm against his throat. The cabin no longer felt like a place to disappear. It felt like the start of something that would last. No questions, no debts, no silence left unexplained. Just two people who had come through cold and fear and doubt and stayed together. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.